task and goal management system going on, right? This might have been maybe you in March or April, right? With kids at home trying to work, there's a million things happening, right? And if you take any moment, right, in time, you've got lots of different goals and things you want to do. And you have to have a way, the brain has to have a way of managing all that, of taking those goals and sequencing or setting out a set of actions that'll actually achieve them. And moreover, it has to monitor your progress as you go and make adjustments on the fly as needed. And this ability to do that, this ability to conceive of goals and things we want to do, seemingly almost any goal, and it doesn't have to be big long-term goals. It can be like, starting your own business or going to college. It can also be simple goals like going to get a cup of coffee. Our ability to do that is at the basis of human intelligence and human ingenuity. It's one thing that makes our species very unique, because no other species can do it at the scale we do. As just one example, right? Most of us changed our behavior radically as a result of this pandemic, right? I mean, almost worldwide, not everybody, unfortunately, but worldwide, lots of people incorporated wearing masks into their everyday behavior, something you'd never probably done before. You didn't grow up wearing masks, most likely, right? It didn't take lots and lots of training. You certainly didn't take thousands or millions of years of evolution to attain this behavior. Rather, you knew it was important to do. You had this abstract idea that I wanted to wear a mask, and you were able to change your behavior. And this seems trivial to us, but it's something that is very hard. It's so hard, in fact, that we have yet to program an AI that can do this kind of thing, artificial intelligence. And there's, again, no other species that comes close to that kind of behavior. And it's crucial to our ability to be independent as adults. It changes over the course of our lifespan as we get older, right? Cognitive control changes. It can be a cause of the loss of independence in old age, but can also be a source of our resilience as we age, right? As we find strategies to help us as we go. But importantly, it's something that also develops over the course of childhood. And that'll be something that we talk about more today. Now, one thing just to sort of, if we were to boil down kind of what this function is doing, okay, at a really simple level, and again, there's a lot to this ability, right? It's that it places our actions in context. And we're doing this all the time. And by context, I mean we can take an abstract idea or an abstract rule, and we can use it to change our behavior. So I'll give you one example. Right, so imagine that, for instance, this is my office. This isn't actually my office, but imagine it was, and you entered this office. Okay, I'm going to bet that none of you are going to sit in this chair. Almost all you're going to pick one of these two chairs to sit in. Okay, and the fact that you do that is because you have a functioning cognitive control system that can represent the idea that your context is somebody else's office. Right, so and you have abstract ideas about norms and things like that, and you probably have an idea right away about whose chair is whose in here, and you can use that to guide your behavior in just that one moment. All right, and this is pervasive in our lives. We're doing it all the time, and it's a crucial function. So ultimately, what cognitive control allows us to do, in the most broadest sense, is bridge knowledge and action. It allows us to connect what we know about the world to how we behave. Now, essential to this in the brain is a structure called the prefrontal cortex. So if you haven't taken neuroanatomy in your life, this sort of divot here is called a sulcus, right? And this is a central sulcus. Everything to the front of this is called the frontal lobe. And at the very front of the frontal lobe is the redundantly named prefrontal cortex, or the front of the frontal lobe, okay? And this part of the brain has long been associated with human intelligence, and with cognitive control or executive function. And part of that is because it's a part of the brain that benefits from information from the rest of the brain about what we're seeing, what we're feeling, how we're doing it. So it's well situated to integrate all that and use it to connect all of that information to how we behave. It's also notably a very recent evolutionary expansion. So if this is a plot from Joaquin Fuster, who this is from an anatomical definition of the prefrontal cortex across lots of different species. And what you can see is roughly, as you kind of go up the scale of intelligent behavior, right, going from, say, monkeys and cats up to our nearest cousins, and here you see a human, the shaded area is the prefrontal cortex. It takes up a larger proportion of our brain than in other species. Right? It's a very large and expanded structure in the human brain. Okay, and so for these reasons, scientists long thought the prefrontal cortex is really important for something like intelligence or executive function. But the big reason that we know it's necessary or crucial for cognitive control comes from cases where we lose that function because of either brain disease or accident or things like that. And I want to give you a couple examples of this just to illustrate this point of the loss between knowledge and action, because these are patients for whom they're able to conceive of their goals. They can think about what they want to do. They can even tell you about it, but they're able to act. They can move and so forth, but they aren't able to connect these two together. So let me give you an example. And I have lots of these that I elaborate in the book, but I'll give you just a couple here. So this is the one is the case of EVR, who was reported by Antonio Damasio in the late 1980s. So EVR, and those are his initials to protect his identity. He was at the time an accountant. He's 44 years old at the time of the report, and he suffered from cancer, and he had a brain tumor that was resected, and it resulted in a large portion of the frontal cortex being removed, prefrontal cortex. Now, he was assessed, as is always the case, after the surgery. And what's interesting is he aced all the clinical tests. So tests of language and motor function and perceptual function, even tests of executive function. He did in the superlative range on these tests. And in his informal interactions with his clinicians, he was very knowledgeable about things like things he knew about. He was like, for instance, he really understood things about like Reagan's economic policy at the time. This was the 80s. But outside of the clinic, it was a totally different story. His life was a disaster, right? It was he had risen before the surgery to the level of a comptroller in his accounting firm, so it's a fairly high, well-respected position. He lost his job within a short period of time due to lots of tardiness and inability to get anything done at his job. He launched into a wild money-making scheme with a partner who was not very reputable, and he lost his life savings. His wife of 17 years left him. He was remarried. He got divorced again. He got remarried again. And at the time of Damasio's report, he was living with his parents and concocting sort of wild money-making schemes without any hope of or ability to follow through on any of them. And in his daily life, he was constantly able to express his goals, and not even big ones like his wild ideas about how to make money, but even things like just going to dinner that night. He could tell you those goals, but he wasn't able to assemble the plan and monitor it and be able to follow through to actually carry out those behaviors. And as a result, even though he was highly intelligent by most measures, he was highly cognitively able, he wasn't able to connect put it all together in the complexity of the world, right, in order to get things done, because he lost this function of cognitive control. And often neurologists will refer to this as environmental dependency. Right, these patients, their behavior, instead of being controlled based on these internal factors like our goals and our context and the rules we want to live by, instead they're controlled by the strongest associations we have with things in the world around us. So you're controlled by the environment. And so a classic example of this is one sort of bedside test of so-called frontal sign is you can say, let's say you have a patient who wears glasses. Okay, so this is a patient who wears glasses. You put the pair of glasses on the table in front of the patient, and then the neurologist will motion to their face, like you're putting on your glasses. And a frontal patient will pick the glasses off the table and put them on their face, even if it's not their glasses. And in fact, even if they're wearing their own pair right now, right? They'll try to cram it over the pair that's on there. And the reason is they're compelled by this very salient stimulus of seeing that motion to do this strong associated action, even though it's not appropriate in this context. And there's lots of other examples of this, even for more complicated actions. For example, this set of pictures comes from a set of studies by Dr. Lermit, who described this syndrome. And Lermit, among the patients he tested was, for instance, this woman had been a nurse for most of her life. She was retired at this point, but presumably she had thousands of times taken someone's blood pressure, right, to the point that it was almost like a pre-compiled routine how to take someone's blood pressure. Right. So Lermit merely gave her a blood pressure apparatus and extended his arm like this, and then she proceeded to just do the whole action. She, took the blood pressure, right? Compelled by that, even though there's no context in which this was an important thing to do at this point, right? That she was supposed to take it. Instead, she's compelled by the environment to do it. So she can't take that internal state and use it to control her behavior. Okay, and so we call this there says that there's a knowledge action dissociation, that sort of knowing is not enough. You can know the rules for what you want to do, right? These patients can have an urgent desire to do them. They can express them to you. They can understand the plan, the goal, but they aren't able to assemble or do the next step. They don't have the mechanisms that allow them to assemble the actions needed to do it. Okay, and so I'll give you one more example of this, right? It can be very, very explicit, right? While this is from a case study of a patient, while being evaluated for the presence of diabetes insipidus, the patient was instructed, don't drink any water, don't go near the water fountain. With a few minutes, he was observed having a drink at the water fountain. When he was asked by the examiner what he'd just been told, he immediately replied, don't drink any water, don't go near the water fountain. So this patient can verbatim repeat the rule, right? But again, is unable to use it to control his behavior and stop himself from this impulse to drink this water. And if that interaction sounds familiar to you, and I'm guessing for many people on this call, your parents, this is an interaction many of us have had probably with younger children, right? Where you say, don't go near that outlet, or don't touch that thing. They go and touch the thing and you say, what did I just say? And they say, oh, and they can tell you exactly what you just said, but they didn't do it. And we often interpret this as being maybe rebelliousness, or they didn't really hear us, they didn't really know, they didn't really want to follow the rule. But the other possibility, and all those are possibly true, but the other possibility is that their cognitive control system, right? These mechanisms are undergoing development, and they're still maturing. So cognitive control or executive function takes a long time to develop and reach maturity. And indeed, the prefrontal cortex is one of the latest structures in the brain to fully mature. So this is a plot from Gogte, a study by Gogte, in which they in a large sample of kids of many ages, they measured the thickness of the gray matter, which is sort of the cell bodies in the cortex, and they used a special measurement technique that allowed them to essentially age that part of cortex. How far along in its maturity was it? And in this plot, the red is less mature and the blue is more mature. At this point in time. And so from age 5 to age 20, and what you can see is at age 5, for example, some areas of cortex have already matured considerably, like areas back here. This is near what we would call visual cortex. So this is a part of the brain that's important for, say, early visual processing or basic visual processing. This is motor cortex, important for basic just movements, right? But you can see that the lateral prefrontal cortex here is largely immature at this stage, right? It's still undergoing development. And indeed, you can see that it remains plastic all the way until even your early 20s, right? There's still plasticity and maturation that's happening. So it has a very protracted and long developmental time course. And we see that in measures of cognitive control and executive function in children, right? It also shows a protracted time course. It showing its biggest gains up to about age 10 to 12, and then continuing refinement throughout adolescence, all the way up into the early 20s. Okay. So this has led to, I think, a recognition that cognitive control develops over time, but we need to be careful here. Okay, I think it's really, and this is something important to take from this discussion. I'm happy to talk about it more. Even though we see this analogy, right, that between children and, for instance, some of the dysexecutive syndrome I was describing, children are not patients, right? They don't have this executive syndrome per se, right? They have a developing system that's developing cognitive control. And I think if we make this mistake, we end up with it led to a lot of confusions. And when I read out in the literature, or in the world, in popular press, I often encounter these kinds of confusions. So I'm going to give you a few. One is the confusion that executive function, right, is one capacity. It's this one thing that needs to develop over time, right? And it's not. This ability to bridge knowledge and action is actually formed from lots of different systems that all need to work together and learn how to work together in order to engage in control. Which leads to our next confusion, which is that executive function only comes online later in life, right? The idea being that we go through that until you get that maturation of the prefrontal cortex, until you're all the way up to age 15, 18, even 20, there's like no control at all, right? The control comes online once you've developed it, right? And that's something often you sort of hear. Even more common is that it takes so long to develop because it's really complicated. So like anything that's like other complicated things in our world, like a stereo system, cognitive control is hard. And so therefore it takes us a long time to wire it up, right? And that's why it's taking such a long time. And as a result, it's vulnerable, Right? I've read this many times as well, that because it takes so long, it's vulnerable to negative environmental influences that can throw it off its course before it gets a chance to come online. Okay. And so this leads to a view of executive function as this sort of CPU of the brain, right? That emerges in adulthood and that is hopelessly complex and really fragile and easy to kind of bump off. But it's not like that. Okay. In reality, children are undergoing our control is developing in children. Okay, it's undergoing a dynamic change. All right, and it emerges first off from lots of interacting systems that need to work together. And so really what the brain has to do is it has to learn policies for controlling itself. It has to learn how to coordinate all of its different systems and in order to connect abstract ideas about what you want to do to the actions that it can actually that it can entail. And learning that requires experience. It requires going out and doing stuff so you can learn how to so the brain can actually learn how to do that kind of coordination. So if we have these principles, we can revise the confusions that we saw before and maybe come up with some very general framework for understanding development. First, control is multifaceted. It's dynamic and it's interactive. So there's no such thing as a single controller of the brain. Okay, there are multiple systems. And indeed, that's one reason why it's so fragile. Why cognitive control is affected in such a wide range, for instance, of mental illness and a wide range of neurological problems is because there's so many ways in which it can be affected. And indeed, two patients or two individuals can show control in different ways for different problems with control for different reasons entirely. Okay, but it's in children, you've got multiple systems that are interacting together. It doesn't come online later in life. In fact, children are always engaging in control, and it does not wait until adulthood, right? How many kids at Gordon learned how to use masks, right, and do in their everyday actions really quickly within like a week or two? They were pros at this, right? Kids have very impressive control systems. Okay, so it's not waiting around until adulthood to get going. It takes so long to develop because it's complex. That's definitely not. There are lots of complex things in the brain. Vision is an incredibly complex problem. The ability to actually figure out from a 2D, two-dimensional retina to be able to know that something's a three-dimensional object is actually one of the hardest problems that exists. You can't do it. It's actually not solvable. The brain has to make all kinds of assumptions and problems in order to solve that vision problem. But the brain figures out how to do that very, very, very early on. Okay, is in the first year of life. It's doing that very well. Okay, so it's not just complexity. Rather, it takes so long because it needs data. It needs to have experience living in order to set the control policies that will help it be able to do things in the future. And in fact, this is a really important point because this allows us to correct this last thing, right? Its protracted time course makes it vulnerable to negative environmental influences. It's surely the case that negative environmental factors will negatively impact somebody. There's no doubt about it. High stress environments, there are lots of things you can do to make things go wrong. But the control is developing not in spite of the environment. It's not trying to be protected until it can kind of get its job done. It's developing because of the environment of the child. Effectively, that first 10 to 20 years of life is a way that your brain is trying to figure out, is using that as a model for how the rest of life is going to go. So it can lay down policies that allow you to plan and control yourself and do the things that you need to do throughout the rest of your adulthood. And so it's really important that it have that opportunity. Okay, so what do we need? Well, kids need them to have, this argues for enrichment. It's long been known that an enriching environment is good for development for all kinds of reasons. Control is definitely, and executive function is definitely a piece of that. Having variable experiences offers a wide range of different opportunities to learn how to control yourself, both now and in the future. It makes it more likely, in fact, that you're going to learn things about yourself that will be applicable later in life. Okay, it argues for unstructured activity. Okay, children have to have a chance to set their own goals and plans and rules and try to follow them. And this is hard. I mean, speaking as a parent today, so much of our kids' time is structured and with adults, and it's adult supervised and completely structured, right? From school to when they come home, like tons of activities they can do, and most of them are under supervision, right? It's really rare that they have a chance to assemble together, come up with their own goal together they want to do, right? And then and plan out and think of the different plans and ways to try to follow it. I mean, even bad ideas, but that they have a chance to kind of do it themselves, set their own goal and plan accordingly, as of having us as parents come in and set and structure it out for them, so that we want them to be successful, to achieve the goal. But the problem is, if we do it for them, they don't learn that way. And that actually leads to the last point: is error-driven learning is really important. Not only do they have to have a chance to set their own goals and try to do things, they have to have a chance to both succeed and to safely fail in order to learn. A good example of this is what good coaches of soccer teams do. As a parent, kids, if they're playing soccer, they're often like horrible about passing and spacing and things like that. And as a parent on a sideline, you're often tempted to tell pass to so and so, or run over there and do whatever, you want to tell them what to do. But good coaches will wait for the kid to make that decision and then correct them. And it's really important, because if you do it that way, the child starts to learn how to interpret their environment. Even this simple example of a soccer game, interpret their environment and decide where to go. If you don't do that, the only thing they learn to do is listen to coach or listen to their parents, right? And so this becomes really important. Okay, so let's take it back then to the Sean example. So this is why I think this project is awesome. This weekend homework project that Gordon does in 5th grade, because first off, it's clearly enriching. I mean, the whole goal is these kids brainstorm ideas they've never done before, they've always wanted to try to do, and it's wide open. They can pick whatever they want, and so Sean had never done a board game. This was a chance to do that, and it's exciting. So it surely helps with enrichment. It's unstructured. It's a semi-structured. It's scaffolded, but within each step, right, it allows it to be unstructured. They have a chance to explore and play in the sandbox of that activity and come up with, for instance, their own plan. Like, how are they going to build this thing? How are they going to reach step 1? And they try to assemble it. And then finally, they're allowed to fail if the plan doesn't work out, right? They try it, doesn't work out, and then they're given help and feedback, and they try again. And so they both gain successes as well as the failures they need to learn from. And so it's a great opportunity to learn from the perspective of cognitive control. So I'll stop there, and thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to take questions on this or other topics related to executive function.
So David, I want to zero in on one thing you were just talking about as you think about bridging the gap between knowledge and action. This is something we see in school every day, right? Where think of a middle school student who says, I know I got to do a better job of completing my homework. I'm going to do a better job. I know I need to. And then the next day, wasn't able to complete the homework all the way, or lost the paper. And then is able to say the same thing, like, oh gosh, I know, Mr. Burnstein. And I'm curious, your thoughts about, the how you see the parent's role in helping, with that failure that helps the child learn, right? Because there's often a rush to be like, well, I'll just be the executive functioning for you. Like, I'll get the paper, I'll put it in your bag. I will make sure that, you signed your name, you did everything you're supposed to do. What are your thoughts about how parents can support their kids who are having this kind of this challenge that they're learning from, and, support their long-term cognitive control in that way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the thing you're pointing out there that is number one is, I think a lot of our temptation is to kind of do it for the kid, either because of the child, either because you want them to obviously have their homework, you want them to come in and succeed academically, you want them to do things that they want to do, right, that they set out, you want them to achieve the goals that they want, and so our temptation very much is to do this for them. So that's the number one thing, right? Is that the child in your example is given the chance, right? It is told, you're responsible for taking your homework, and even the chance to show up one day and not have it, right? And that's something, that's an experience they could have. That's actually a really, really important step. What can you do though for support? And I do think there's good evidence that scaffolding helps. So scaffolding is an idea that you don't completely throw a child into the deep end and say sink or swim. Rather, what you try to do is you provide that support. So okay, we're going to provide support in terms of we'll help you we'll come up with a plan together about how you're going to remember your homework. Right? You ask them what do you think, what could you have done better yesterday, or what would have allowed you to remember it, and then you can try to help them plan that out. And then when you think that they've got it, now you back off again and allow them to be free again and see if they've learned it. And if not, you can come back in and try to scaffold. And those types of scaffolding strategies really help. The key is that they're not going to feel like they've really let you down as a parent if they forget their homework, right? You said it's okay to have those expectations, right? So that they can feel okay about failing in that sense, right? It's not a stressful thing for them in that way. But they're also given that opportunity to where they need to try to come up with a plan, and they're given the chance to fail if necessary. And then you give them support in terms of succeeding the next time. And of course, when they succeed, let them know it.
I love chapter 8, right? That talks about information retrieval. And you do a thing where you compare the human brain and why it's superior to, my smartphone or Google as a way to get the information we want in an efficient way. Noni often talks about, we want to prepare kids at Gordon School to solve problems they've never seen before. And I'd make an argument that now that she's a public health expert, she's in a good position to to sing that song. How can you talk a little bit about this idea of making a retrieval plan? How does making a retrieval plan for kids, right, help us kind of solve problems or make estimated guesses about important things that we've never seen before?
Yeah, so I think the distinction first to highlight is that, why would our memory be better than a smartphone? Would you say? People may be wondering, what's he talking about? Why would our memory ever be better than a smartphone, right? I can't remember half the numbers anymore in my phone. I've lost my memory entirely. So the answer is that a human memory really isn't. Its main function isn't strictly storing something in a way that we can get it back without any loss of information, right? But rather, what it excels at doing is bring information to mind that's useful for us. Right, what we need to do, right? So in that sense, it's less analogous to your smartphone and more analogous to a Google search engine, right? In the sense that, when you want to retrieve something from the knowledge base of the internet, right, by typing a search term into Google, it's going to give you guesses about what's useful given what you asked it for. Okay, and Google's pretty good at that. Our brain is 100 times better than Google in terms of based on what we know, we at a moment's notice, right? We don't even notice it for the most part, except when it fails and we forget something, right? How much information is coming to mind as we're doing what we're doing, and it's based on the task that we're engaged in. So with that in mind, then, anytime you want to engage in retrieval, it's helpful to have to think about memory in terms of use. And a retrieval plan means you sort of come up with a plan that would either a structure based on what you already know that allows you to retrieve the information you need. So as an example, right, if you're trying to remember, all the capitals of the US states, it's a really hard memory problem, right? If you're doing that, it would be a very hard thing just to try to name them all. Right. In fact, most people just will fail. Right. Even if you knew all the capitals, you just can't do it. If you want to name all the states, you'll run out at some point. You just can't think of anymore, and that's for a variety of reasons within the human memory system. But if you come up with a plan, for example, let's say you kind of know that the states aren't just randomly scattered about the world. They have an organization, right? There's a country out there. You can walk your way through the country and use that as a cue to memory. Right, you start up in the Northeast and you make your way south and you kind of do a loop, and as you go, you try to name the states as you go, right, or the capitals as you go. That's going to help your memory a lot. And as you study, or if you're trying to learn something, if you attach it to those knowledge structures and you organize your learning materials in that way, it will likewise aid your memory, because that's going to be a cue. It tells, as soon as you start trying to engage in that task, you're going to be able to have access to that kind of memory better.
There's so much there, right? That's useful for kids, and by doing is how they're going to learn and really remember, right? It's the experience that we're trying to get them to have.
That's right.
I think about, you ask any middle school teachers, like one of my great pet peeves is kids who study ineffectively, right? And making sure that we're actively, if we're really trying to learn something, that we're doing it actively. And so an example would be, I think of kids, when I used to teach 8th grade humanities, studying for a vocab quiz, and they'd be looking at their book, right? They'd look at the words. I'd say, close your book. like you get a blank piece of paper and write down, sentences using the words, and then look at your book to be able to see, what did you not have on there? It's harder, right? You're going to make yourself work, but the doing it is going to be a better way for you to study than by just passively reading the words over and over and over again.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think using any kind of active study you do, whether it's making sentences with words you're trying to memorize or make a story out of them, or if you're so inclined, try to grab a parent or a sibling or a friend from the class and try to give them the lesson. That's the best way. You never learn something better than you try to teach it, right? As the teachers in here will know. And that, because it forces you to think about things in new ways constantly to try to explain it to somebody, it becomes useful, and it's a good way to learn. And in fact, if you have, it also helps with something that's another obstacle, is the illusion of clarity. So many of us think we especially like, a teacher will tell you something. Here's a concept, right? That, I just told everybody about executive function or whatever, right? And maybe you listen to me, like, oh, that sounds reasonable. I think I get it. Right? I'm going to test you on that later in the week. If I asked you to go and present my slides, it would suddenly become very apparent to you how much of that actually didn't get in, right? And it wasn't used, right? Until you actually start doing it. It exposes all the spots where that information didn't get linked into knowledge that you need, right? It wasn't elaborated in such a way that you have those strings to pull it back. And so that kind of active study is so much better than trying to rote memorize or just look or repeats the thing over and over or do anything like that doesn't really connect it into a knowledge structure.
So we've got some great questions rolling in. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, raise your hand. The first question from a graduate of the University of Michigan, Michael Siegel, who asks, not sure if you're I'm curious about the extent to which emotional experience and things like motivation are bound up with executive functioning, or if you see them as discrete functions. For example, if we suffer from depression and or anxiety, is it likely that executive functioning will be adversely affected?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. So it is very closely tied to executive function and cognitive control. In fact, I devote actually a whole chapter of the book to this topic, because what we know now, when the history here, when we first started studying cognitive control and executive function, people weren't talking about emotion. They weren't talking about things like related to motivation and so forth. We now know that cognitive control is motivated. In fact, we can explain most of what we do. When we do a task, we're doing it because we want to do that task. And when we avoid tasks, right, we often do it because of there's a aversive experience of mental effort for tasks that engage a lot of control. And so we actually do a kind of a cost benefit trade-off. So our motivation, when we do something, we're doing an online, on the fly cost benefit analysis. This task I want to do, I want to write this email right now, right? That has some benefit, right? But it's I really hate writing it. So it has this also mental effort cost, and I'm discounting the benefit I'm getting, right, from writing that email, given the mental effort cost of writing it. And I'm doing that relative to all the other things I could be doing, right? Instead of writing that email, I could be also like, watching this television show I like, or I could be, on jumping on social media and looking at pictures of people's pets or whatever, right? And so all of those things are going to be, you're computing together. And a lot of what control is actually doing is balancing that cost benefit analysis over different scales of time, over different levels of abstraction, how it's immediacy, or is it useful in the future, and keeping that running. So to your question about something like depression or other types of clinical conditions that we know impact motivational systems, they will inherently affect that. Right, that will be, as a result, it's going to affect how the brain engages in that cost benefit analysis, and it can affect things related to, obviously, the tasks we do, our motivation to work with certain types of tasks or to engage in certain types of tasks. It even affects our memory, right, and for our ability to because as we were just talking about, memory is so tied to use. What we remember is also colored by that motivational element.
Cameron has a great question. You mentioned that the prefrontal cortex continues to be plastic until mid-20s. Can you talk about factors that negatively impact the development of the prefrontal cortex? For example, use of drugs, alcohol, too much screen time, passive technology use.
I have to say my internet just froze at like a crucial part as you read. Can you just ask the question again?
Sure. Can you talk about the factors that can negatively impact the development of the prefrontal cortex? For example, use of drugs or alcohol, too much screen time, or passive technology use?
Sure. Things like uh, so there are a bunch of factors. Right? So extreme conditions like extreme stress and abuse, so forth, have been shown to cause a wide range of problems, and among those are issues in cognitive control and executive functions. That can definitely be that can arise from those kinds of environmental factors. Certainly, drugs and alcohol, different drugs and alcohol can have global effects on the brain and specific effects. For instance, there are certain types of drugs that affect the neurotransmitter system called the dopamine system, and that's a really important system for cognitive control. I haven't talked at all today about mechanisms of control in the brain, like how the brain actually does it, but one of the core mechanisms is related to structures in the basal ganglia and in the prefrontal cortex, which are parts of the brain that are related to those systems. So it definitely will be affected by drug use. It gets affected by alcohol abuse and so forth. Also, because of its multifaceted nature, it's vulnerable to almost any condition in the environment, including the ones you're describing, that will affect the brain or will affect other kinds of clinical conditions, or will result in clinical conditions, will end up having some effect in cognitive control. Because again, it's not just one thing. It's basically it's the assembly. It's putting it all together in multiple pieces. Now, screen time is a tough one because the data here are not necessarily clear in terms of what the effect of screen time is. And so I don't feel right now that there's enough data to say one way or the other. So if anything, it does seem like some aspects of social media maybe may have some negative effects, but it's not clear yet in terms of screen time.
That's great news, because I was working from home for part of today and my kids spend an ample amount of time on Disney Plus, and I'm happy to know I didn't do too much long-term damage. or not conclusive yet, which I'll take.
All I said is I don't know.
I'll take that's a win.
I dodged that.
Crystal asked if you could talk about the difference between executive function and cognitive control.
Sure, yeah. So executive function is a term that came out of neuropsychology, which is is an important branch, a clinical branch that tries to assess brain function in clinical conditions. And if there's a subtle difference, is that executive function has emphasized the skills of the executive. So there's sets of executive skills like planning or inhibition, which would mean like the ability to stop yourself from doing something, or decision making, or attention, or working memory, for example. And those are all definitely expressions of control. But the reason why I think a lot of neuroscientists and cognitive neuroscientists have moved to using cognitive control instead of executive function is that there's not a sort of a basis in the brain per se of those skills. It's not like you have certain structures or place in the brain that does planning or something, right? And that's a separate skill a module that can, or a mental faculty that can be trained separate from all the rest of the pieces of it. Control is multifaceted. There's lots of different moving parts there, but they all work together to achieve these different types of functions. And so I think in terms of so from a scientific perspective, at the level of the way we're theorizing about this function now, control is a better term because it actually relates to, it borrows its term from control engineering notions of control, sort of like your thermostat, right? So your thermostat's a control system in the sense it has a set point, right? Some temperature, and it's going to increase or decrease that temperature. It monitors the temperature, and it's going to increase or decrease it depending on how deviated it is from that set point. And so cognitive control is here. I want to do whatever, and I have to engage in something to maintain my task performance towards that in time. And that's really the analogy. I think that people are why people use that term now more than executive function. Nothing wrong with executive function. We can use that, and it's a widely and colloquially used term, and it's still used in a lot of contexts. But I use cognitive control. But we're essentially talking about the same thing.
So David, it will come as no surprise that, as the middle school director at Gordon, one of my favorite parts of the book was about unstructured play and the benefit of unstructured play. Now, I think about, when I have a 7th grader, right? And when I was 13, I had the parents who were known as the overprotective parents. And yet there were times when I was 13 in the summer, my parents couldn't tell you where I was, like whose friends, what house I was at. We were making up games. We were figuring out rules. We were, and time and again, I have conversations with families that say like, that was their experience, but their kids don't have that. Now, I think this is a particularly relevant conversation as we're heading into winter break, right? We don't have as many structured activities, right? That we might normally have over a winter break. And while it might not be that our kids are out playing in the neighborhood in the same way, can you talk a little bit about like, what are the kinds of activities of unstructured play, let's just say over a pandemic winter break, that might be useful, and how are those useful for kids' development?
Wow, that's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to what are the unstructured activities that we can do now. I can give you some idea. I mean, first off, just to sort of emphasize what you're saying, I do think that the opportunities for unstructured, self-directed play among children today it seems much less than it was, years ago. I mean, the ability just to assemble in multi-age groups, right, and come up with your own idea what you want to do, good or bad, and to plan that out and carry it out and negotiate it, among each other, what you're going to do and all of these kinds of things. It still happens maybe at recess, but it's not the sort of it's not a major staple of what we do, right? No one's sending their kids for the most part, independently to walk down to the park anymore and see what kids are there to hang out with, and so that's something that is very important from the perspective of that unstructured, time is very important. I mean, one thing so it's hard anyway. During the pandemic, it's even harder, right? Because we have to isolate in all these ways, and they can't really assemble with other kids. I mean, one thing I've seen, our kids do that I think has been great, and I have no data on this being like a good unstructured activity. So I'm speaking as a parent, not as a scientist in this moment. But is they can Zoom together and play games over Zoom, and actually that has allowed them to actually assemble in multi-age groups and come up with what game they want to play, and they organize the rules themselves and they decide what they want to do and so forth. And that's actually been great to see. It's actually been a park that doesn't exist actually outside the pandemic, right? You can actually go and say, who wants to get together and see if so and so, and multiple kids kind of come on or go off and decide what they want to do in a way that that they couldn't do otherwise. And so I think that's interesting to see. And so that's at least one activity that they've been able to, that I've seen our kids do.
Can you talk, Marie has a question about, she gets at the intersection of cognitive control and ADHD. And how do you, any thoughts you have about how do you support ADHD children who may be insecure about their ability to learn, and what we know about cognitive control and ADHD?
Well, I'm not a clinician, so I'm not going to really provide advice in terms of the best way to help a child with ADHD per se. I think that is a very good question. I do think though that all children, we're giving them the support is similar in the sense that you need to, that they can learn, right, in terms of giving them opportunities to get out and try things, right, and then giving them that support. However, it is important to talk to a clinician about a child's limits, right? You don't want to put them in a position where they can't do something, right, and as a result they're gonna suffer failure repeatedly and be discouraged by that. So I think if you're outside of the context, if you're in the context of a clinical condition, it's important to have this. The only thing this speaks to is the importance of having that conversation with a clinician and saying that you have this as a goal for your child, right, and what do you need to do, or what would be different?
Thank you. Amy asks, on the topic of stress, she says she's curious about the fight or flight response and its impact on cognitive control. She said she's heard that when you're in that mode, you lose access to your prefrontal cortex. Is that an accurate description? Can you temporarily lose access to a part of your brain?
I know of no evidence that would say that you would lose access to a part of your brain. It's certainly the case that you can anything that happens fast, I mean, the prefrontal cortex is always active. And in fact, I mean, it's important also to note that this is a big dynamic network, right? So it's all interacting with each other, and it's not just the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is one part of a large network that's interacting. And so it's not the case that any part of your brain can be turned off. It's not the case, in case you haven't had this rumor dispelled for you, it's not the case we only use 5% of your brain. You're using your whole brain all the time. It is the case, however, that control is slow, right? So if we want to engage, for the most part, if you want to control yourself using an explicit rule or goal you have or decision you want to make, it's going to be a relatively slow response relative to the kinds of automatic responses, like I was describing in a patient that has a well-practiced, strong association with an external input, right? Those tend to be very fast and obligatory. Okay, and so in any context, it could be related to fight or flight, or it could be other cases where you have an impulse to do something. If you don't take time, right? If there's not enough time for the control system to engage, you could be captured by the strongest associated action with that thing, which might be the wrong thing to do. And that doesn't even happen just in actions; it can even happen in decision making. So there's another book, which is quite good, by Danny Kahneman, called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, which is all about neuroeconomic decisions. And he highlights these two sort of systems of reasoning, a slow system and a fast system. And the fast system tends to make decisions that are not that aren't optimal if you're really trying to make a good decision, like that respects the likelihood, the base rate likelihood of a particular outcome and things like that. Rather, you need the slow system for that. And ultimately, it maps very strongly onto this same distinction, right? That if we're moving quickly, we really don't have a chance for the control system to engage and be able to contextualize it. So you might, if you're thinking fight or flight, you might walk into a room, see something that looks kind of like a snake on the ground, yell and run before you had a chance to say, wait a minute, I'm in my house. Very unlikely on the third floor of my little home in Providence, there's a snake on the floor. I should probably stop myself from doing it. You might end up doing it, before you have a chance to control, even based on that simple context.
So does that also speak then to, again, your point earlier about kids who know the right thing to do and the right thing, they'll have the knowledge, they'll tell you, but when they're, again, at recess and things are moving quickly, it's harder to kind of slow down that control for them and do the thing that they have the knowledge to do. Is that?
Yeah, it could be that. It can be that, in fact, part of it is knowing when to control yourself, right? There's been a lot of studies of things like slips of action, so slips of action are kind of like errors. They're like when you do something like you're driving to a friend's house, but the first 2/3 of the route are the same way you go to the office. You end up at your work instead of your friend's house or something before you realize what happened. Or you put the can of peas in the fridge and the milk in the cabinet. Those kinds of things are slips of action. So work on that suggests that a lot of what's important is there are particular points where you have to the control system needs to engage to monitor what you're doing. Right? There's a particular point where you need to be able to pay attention. If you miss that, so if you don't engage control there, then you're likely to get captured or sent off track. In fact, also, by the way, if you check too early at the wrong time, you can also mess yourself up. Like if I don't know if anybody plays a musical instrument, if you learn learn a particular piece really well, if you pay attention at the wrong time, you're going to throw yourself off there too, right? So when to check is really important. When to engage control matters, and that means part of learning to control yourself is just learning when to do it. Right, and you have to kind of remember to engage in control at this point. And so one thing that can happen with a kid in school who wants to do something and does it and then realize, oh, why did I do that? Right, is that they didn't check at the right moment, right, and that hasn't been set up. They didn't set up the right policy, right, to remind themselves to do it, or they just didn't engage.
Got time for a couple more questions. Sarah asks, in your years of work on this, which, if any, finding most surprised you?
That's a very good question. I think I was surprised that the brain actually organizes maybe a bit technical, but if you okay, so you think of any action that you have, okay, you can describe it at many different levels of abstraction. So I can think of like me making a cup of coffee. I could describe that in terms of the individual movements of like my fingers and my arms and everything as I'm making it. And I could also describe it in a set of subtasks, like I'm grinding beans and I'm putting them in a drip machine and I'm adding water. And I could also describe at the highest level, just like making coffee. Okay, and so I have all of these levels at once that I can think about a task. And it turns out the brain, the human brain, actually tracks all of these different levels and engages in control of these different levels at the same time. And I think that was, I wouldn't say it's surprising, because it was surprising that we have this capacity basically to plan and operate at multiple levels of abstraction at the same moment. And I think that opened up for me a very new way of thinking about the way we control ourselves, and the way the brain's organized.
Thank you.
Jordan asks, is there a way to trigger a control action or consideration? He says, I use a vibrate button with my dog's e-collar. I don't have that button for my kid, but I always wonder how to cause that same kind of interrupt with a child that is so focused on something that they can't come up to consider a transition.
Yeah, that's a good question, right? Is there a way to do a break? Right. In fact, it's even worse. Like a lot of little kids' toys, will call back to the kid. Have you ever noticed that? They do break their attention, and then it's programmed to wait a few seconds and then make a bunch of beeps and things. So you see these kids get pulled back into it. So it's very hard to get them to break what they're doing, and so forth. So part of learning to our control is situated in our environment. It's situated in our world. So we aren't just controlling ourselves based on what's in our heads. We also have all of our world around us, and we can actually aid and support our control system with our environment. It's sort of what you're describing. A psychologist would call it a forcing function, right? Is it something that would force you to engage in control in your environment so you don't have to remember to do it? This is if I want to remember to bring my keys with me when I leave the house, I can hang them on the doorknob or something. So I make sure I get them when I go. And you can do that actually even at the level of the things that make control hard. For example, one reason why multitasking is so difficult is we do lots of tasks in the same environment, and they come to and cues in our environment make those tasks compete. So we see it's something we associate with one task that we're not doing, but it comes to mind, that causes competition in the brain. And so one thing you can do is try to structure your environment so that those cues are minimized between tasks. Try to create separate spaces for doing certain types of tasks that would otherwise conflict, and that can aid the control system in doing its job. So you're extending your cognition to some extent out into the world around you, and those are helpful strategies when you can do it.
So the competing, things that compete would be I'm working from home and my kid's calling for me and my text is buzzing and my email's going up, right? And that it's putting pressure on the multitasking that's trying to get me to kind of make a choice. And you're talking about, and I think about, when we talk about for kids, when they go to study, not studying with their phone next to them, or working in a controlled environment, the same, spot at the dining room table or something. I think that gets at what you're talking about, right? How to get kids to help them avoid multitasking so they can do the tasks in front of them.
That's right. And in fact, if they're able to be consistent, if they do a particular hard task, writing or doing something at the same place and the same time of day, all the other things, all of those, not only does it help in terms of keeping other task cues from distracting, it helps everything about that environment is a link to the memory of that task. It cues that, it makes it easier to get back into the set of the tasks that you want to do. And so it's also helpful. It's not going to cure multitasking costs, right? Multitasking is just a fascinating matter in life, and it can just not be better. It's a palliative, but it will help with those.
Bob wants to know, what do you know about EMDR therapy and how it functions to remap trauma experiences in the brain and help a person regain cognitive function that may have been detoured by the trauma?
I'm not familiar with that therapy. I can't comment on it. I'm sorry.
Something to Google later. And Karen leaves a always great to call up former YK teacher Neville Mata. She used to reference the prefrontal cortex in her classes, and Karen remembers that being used when kids were acting out or getting them ready for learning, so their PFC could function properly. Any final questions tonight before we say goodnight? Well, I want to thank you again. First of all, Frances Martindale, the great Frances Martindale, for organizing so many incredible book fair events over the last few weeks. Authors from all over, lots of different kinds of books, and extraordinary job by you, Frances Martindale. Take a bow.
Yeah. And thank you to everybody who helped, literally everybody, and two people who are here tonight in particular, Cynthia Ragona and Karen Eisenberg, actually three, and Sarah Funk Butler. Thank you.
And David, thank you so much for spending time with us tonight and helping us better understand cognitive control. Makes a great holiday gift. I recommend it.
This is a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Have a great night, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Gabe.
Thanks, Gabe.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
So much.
Bye-bye,
Night.
everyone.
Let me know when you find a. Gabe's like, he needs that. Later.
All right.
David, that was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was good. That was fun.
That was awesome.
I hope it was helpful to people.
Two of you. Awesome.
Really well laid out, really well organized,
Yeah.
super clear, making complicated ideas really understandable for us. I appreciate it.
Right. And
I'm
beautifully
glad you enjoyed it.
moderated, Gabe. Beautifully moderated.
Yeah, you picked fantastic questions to
Yeah.
ask.
Yeah.
All right, have a good night.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Gabe.